Right, so we're now going to move on to school street enforcement, which I'm going to present. So I don't need to introduce myself again. And I've supported a lot of school streets across Manchester, so I just wanted to share my experience. So first of all, a little bit about how school streets are enforced. I want to talk about the legal side. So first of all, you cannot close a road unless you've got what's called a traffic regulation order. That's something that's issued by the council. And that provides details of the closure, it provides the times the road's going to be closed, which road's closed, so on, over what period. And if the road's going to be covered over a longish time, sorry, I'm reading my notes, I realise that I can't see my notes. I'm not as good as the others that can just do it off the top of their head. If the closure is going to be happening over a longish period of time, the council might also put signs at either end of the road so you can see what those look like in that photo. And I think the important point to make is that even though the road might be legally closed, so the road that we did today had a legal order on it, the only reason that cars weren't driving up and down on it was that we had physically enforced that. And if we didn't have those barriers there, cars would drive up and down there and there would be no penalty for doing that, because unless you've got someone who can issue a penalty at the time, there is no consequence. And this is where volunteer marshals and barriers come in. So barriers are put into place to close the roads, and then the marshal volunteers manage those closures. And I'd like to say, that can be quite difficult, and everyone here will tell you that finding volunteers twice a day can be pretty onerous. To prevent this reliance on barriers, most councils, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a minute, can use cameras to physically enforce the legal enforcement. And to issue fines to non-exempt motor vehicles entering the school street during its hours of operation. So I mentioned traffic regulation orders. Now the one we used today was a one-off one, and that's called a temporary traffic regulation order. And usually you're allowed to up to 3 a year to do an ad hoc school street. If you've never done a school street before, it's a really good way of starting off. The next type of one is what's called an experimental one, and that's in its name, is that it's something that you can use over a longer period to try out a school street. And that could usually cover up to 18 months. So that allows you to have a school street every term time day and explore whether it's the right thing to do. And part of that process will be that the council will need to consult with the public before they put one of these in place. So this is where it starts to be really important that you're engaging with your community. The final type of traffic order is the permanent one. Over the last few years, Transport for Greater Manchester have been supporting a number of schools across GM with experimental traffic orders. And for example, in Manchester now, there are 8 schools that have now moved from the experimental ones to the permanent ones. And this means that everybody's happy with the scheme, it's been successful, it is now permanently in place every term time day. And again, councils are required to provide some notice before they do this and kind of look at any objections. Hopefully, if you've gone through a good consultative process as you go through this, then everybody's on board. Not always the case, and I know Tiffany from the school that she's been supported in Chorlton in Manchester. There were a lot of challenges, but they did eventually get there. I just want to stress this because it's really confusing for people. Even though legally cars are not allowed to drive through a school street, if there's a traffic regulation order, they will. If there's no physical barrier, they will, and there's nothing you can do to stop them. However, what's changed in Greater Manchester, which wasn't there before, is that the government has now allowed councils outside of London to have the powers to enforce moving traffic offences, which sounds something quite magical, but it's a long, drawn-out process. And what that means is that whereas it used to be reliant on the police to issue fines if somebody contravened the order, now councils are allowed to force that, and the way that they would normally enforce that is through using cameras, particularly automatic number plate recognition, but not always. Now, all councils over the last few years, apart from Tameside, is there anyone from Tameside here? I don't think so.
Yeah, me.
Oh, sorry. Steve will be able to tell us about this then. Have these powers. I'm not sure where Tameside's up to not happening, I don't think. Sadly, I don't know why. And that means that they can put cameras in place, which is fantastic. Cameras work really well. However, they also cost money. Up to now, only Wigan and Oldham have used these powers with school streets, with cameras. Lots of councils do have plans to use them. A lot of them are just trying to sort out the funding for the cameras. But it's worth saying that Greater Manchester and Dame Sarah Storey has committed to there being 100 permanent school streets across Greater Manchester, and ones that are not enforced by volunteers by 2028. So I think that's a really important policy decision. So most schools, when they start doing school streets, will start with barriers. However, again, I know that there is some ambition within Greater Manchester to move straight to cameras. And it will be different for different schools as to what's appropriate. There's lots of different types of barriers you've seen. If you came here earlier, you'd see we just had the road ahead closed. You can use these planters. You can use concertina barriers. You'll have to decide what's best. Different schools will need different types of barriers depending on the location. And you may have more than one end to your school street, or you may be on a cul-de-sac. The schools that were part of the last cohort from Transport for Greater Manchester were funded and given barriers. I know there's a new cohort coming online. I'm not sure. They can perhaps confirm whether those will be issued as well. But if you do need to buy them, the road ahead signs cost about £50–60, cones about £10. I've got to say, most of the cones that we're in possession of we've acquired from various places. And concertina barriers, I think about £120, as do the planters. Whatever you've got to have, it's got to be movable, and you've got to find somewhere safe to store it at school. People will take them. And quite often we found when there's been a marathon or something, like our barriers have been taken because they got confused with the marathon barriers. Okay, so using barriers safely, there's a few things here. I'm not really going to go into that too much, but I think it's worth saying that drivers fairly frequently have been known to drive onto the pavement to get around the barriers. So cones become very, very important in preventing some of that. It's important that you do stay behind the barrier so that you don't get run over as a volunteer, and not move into moving traffic. And I think the thing I'd like to make really clear, and although we had it today as more of a play street, a school street is not a play street. It's not traffic free. There will be some vehicles potentially driving through that. And I think it's important that parents have a really clear understanding of that, that it's a quiet street, but it will potentially have some traffic.
Do you remember, Cazz, when Steve Marston, our first neighbourhood officer, when he nearly got run over by a local resident who was really upset that the roads had been closed, and this was our first school street. But I think that's when the residents got really upset. Because not the parents. The parents knew what was happening, but the residents were really upset that they couldn't access the road, and so one nearly tried to run. Poor thing, he had to hop out of the way in time, which was quite lucky.
So hazardous of being a volunteer. There's lots of information in these slides, and I'm not going to go through all of it because we will be sending them out. But volunteers could be teachers, they could be parents, they could be residents, they could be someone who's part of the community.
Especially if you're in a high school, they could be students themselves, and I think that's a really powerful thing. My experience of working with student volunteer marshals has been amazing, and they are, quite scary if anyone tries to contravene what's going on. So usually you'll have a volunteer coordinator who's kind of responsible, but it's important to say you're not responsible as a volunteer for traffic management or supervision of children. There's a little bit here about best practice. You might have seen some of that as we did it. So everyone should be wearing high vis. Ideally, have 2 marshals at each barrier. If you're more experienced, you can manage with 1. If you're lucky enough to have enough volunteers on the school street, have 1 person whose job it is to escort any exempt vehicles to come through. Everybody should know what their roles are. We did do a training video for marshals, and we'll be sending you the link for that. Just talking about exemptions, and I think, Hannah, you touched on that. There is no kind of specific exemption criteria. It's kind of up to the school. I'd prefer it was a little bit more... it came perhaps from the council, from the government, but there will be vehicles, so residents are always exempt. If they live within the school street, they may need to leave or come in. One of the things that we've done, and you don't have to do this, but we created a little exemption badge in a bright colour so that residents could put it on their dashboards, and it just meant that when they were needing to leave or go, they didn't have to explain themselves to the volunteers. The volunteer could just see the badge and just let them in or out. Typically, that's the kind of exemptions that you see. So you've got to let through emergency vehicles, you've got to let through residents. Ideally, you should have the school should agree any parents that need to come through for whatever reason. Obviously, carers for vulnerable residents, any utility providers. People that shouldn't come through, although they think it's school staff. All of this is about encouraging staff, if they can, to come a different way as well, but also not parking in car park if they don't get there early enough. Parents, delivery drivers, kind of up to you, or tradespeople or visitors. I think if in doubt, don't have an argument with someone if they're really adamant about coming through. Just let them through. It's not worth it. One of the things we did try and arrange was for the bin wagons not to come through when it's at School Street. I think we've done that about 10 times, and they keep getting it, and then they keep forgetting, and we nearly had it today. It's really not great having the bin wagon drive through the School Street. It's a little bit here. Again, I'm not going to go through it all, but it might be useful to read. One of the things we're going to give you is a volunteer briefing template, which you can use to write your guidance for your volunteers. And that's the role of the coordinator should be to deliver that briefing to anyone who's new to volunteering. Just a little bit about, what to do, what happens if someone needs to leave or come in. How to, particularly around diversions, so make sure that all your volunteers have a really good, clear understanding of where a diversion is, if somebody needs to go round. It's good to have a little map on the briefing for them so that they can see where the diversions are, so they can explain it to drivers. Dealing with issues. I'd say it's relatively rare that you're faced with a difficult situation with a member of public, but unfortunately it does happen. And again, this is kind of part of the briefing, that we do give the volunteers a little bit of guidance about how to deal with difficult situations, and what to do if they can't handle it. And that might even be, be escalated to ringing 999 if necessary. We always give the volunteers the phone number of the lead coordinator as well, so all the head teachers, so that they can call. I think the important thing to remember is that often when people get angry or grumpy, it's not always something personal. I remember it happening to me, and the man I was talking to was absolutely beside himself with rage, But it was because he'd been on a really long night shift and he was really tired and he just wanted to get home, and we were stopping him getting to his bed as far as he was concerned, you know. So just be aware of that. Pavement parking. Oh my goodness, you know, outside and near schools. People would love to drive it through the school gate and drop their kids off at the door. And there is dangerous pavement parking. And even if you put the barriers up, people will park as close to the barriers as they can. You can ask the council to send out a traffic enforcement officer, and they will come out sometimes and issue tickets. But you often will need to use cones to try and keep it clear around the barriers. One thing that's quite nice is to have these, we did some of these pavements for people that looked a little bit like penalty notices to hand out to parents. We've touched on this a little bit. When you're a volunteer, it's good to give the volunteers some guidance around the positive reasons for having a school street. And this is really important, I think, when we talked about engaging the community and getting everybody on side before you move to a permanent school street. So make sure that all residents and parents receive notification about the school street before the scheme starts. Probably about 2 out of 10 will actually get that, so you have to keep doing it over and over again. But the advantage of having volunteers is that there is someone visible on the street that can talk about the benefits of school streets and have conversations, and that helping community on the journey with you, and giving the volunteers a leaflet to hand out can also be useful to help with that conversation. Got a bit in there that you can use to talk about benefits. I always think it's really ironic that most parents you talk to say that they drive to school because it's too unsafe for their children to walk because there's too many cars on the road. So, yep. Impact of enforcement. As Hannah said, our experience is that school streets do, when you close the roads, initially there will be an increase in traffic on adjacent streets. However, very quickly it does return to normal. It doesn't get rid of inconsiderate or dangerous driver behaviour. You can have a beautiful experience in the school street, but it's absolute mayhem on the other side of the barrier, so be aware of that. And I'd say, you know, in the longer term, schools may be happy to use barriers, particularly if they're on a cul-de-sac, but generally the view is that we should be moving to cameras, not for everyone, but a lot of school streets do need cameras. And there's got to be something, because if there's no consequence for drivers, they will drive through. Just the last few points. Generally, I think, you know, it's a really positive experience for volunteers, and it's a great way to start the process. And as you mentioned, it's the unexpected outcome is increased community cohesion, either between the volunteers or with the wider neighbourhood. But marshalling depends on a limited number of dedicated volunteers, and that means that if you're at a school where there are parents that have less free time to do this kind of thing, it means that you're not going to be able to have a school street, so it's a bit of a social justice issue for me. It's also really hard to maintain a consistent rota over time. The one at Manley Park, they've been doing it for like 2.5 years now, and I think, Tiffany, you'd say the same. You know, you're just like waiting for cameras to come. It's not a long-term viable option for most schools. Cameras do cost money. They will be difficulties and complexities with managing that. Exemptions for residents and parents, I have to get used to it. There will be a 6-month grace period whenever you put one in. So there might be a bit of a negative perception initially. But, you know, it does remove that need for barriers and volunteers. And of course, it does increase compliance very quickly. And the advantage is that the school street is enforced every day forever. You're not reliant on volunteers. It's gone really well where they have done that in Oldham. There's an example there. Active travel doubled, park and stride increased by 1/4. Lots of positive feedback from parents. So that's mine. There's quite a lot of information there. Sorry.